Have you ever wondered why games in Magic Arena go blazing fast for the first few turns, then all of a sudden there's very noticeable periodic stops during turns? You're not alone. Ever felt frustrated playing against Control because everything is just painfully slow? You're not alone. Are you tired of me saying you're not alone? You're not. Okay, that's enough. The reason for the aforementioned is due to this concept not well explained in Magic Arena, and it's called priority. There's actually a long list of steps and phases players technically go through every single turn. In this video, I'm going to try explaining just enough so that you don't get inundated with information while being able to weaponize this knowledge in your ranked matches. I would like to preface by defining legal action, as I'm going to be using it often throughout this video. Examples of legal actions are casting a spell following timing restrictions while being able to pay for all of its associated costs, and having legal targets for spells that require targets. Activating an ability with the aforementioned clauses. Declaring attackers or blockers for combat, as well as playing a land on your turn if you haven't played land for the turn. Now there are cards in game such as Azusa and Leyline of Anticipation that bend the rules a little, but we are not going to account for those for the sake of brevity. With that out of the way, let's talk about priority. Technically, priority is given to all players every single time the game progresses through each of these steps and phases. This means that players are given priority that many times during every single turn, and that translates to the need to click next that many times, which would be extremely cumbersome. Thankfully, Magic Arena denies priority for players who have no legal actions to take, and sometimes even when there are legal actions. Stick around until the end of the video to see an example about that. The way you can weaponize this is by paying attention to when your opponent is both given and denied priority. And by denied, I mean when Magic Arena automatically passes priority for them. In case you haven't realized, there is actually a visual cue shown when your opponent is given priority. Their avatar lights up like this. Paying attention to this allows you to deduce what cards your opponent has. Let's start with a simple example. In this game, I'm up against Elves, which usually runs a single type of instant, 4 copies of Collected Company, or just Coco in short. In the current board state, casting Coco is a legal action as they are able to generate enough mana to cast the spell. In this instance, I checked for an incoming Coco by casting Search for Azcanta. Notice how their avatar lit up? This essentially tells us that they have available legal actions to take, and since the only instance Elves run are Coco, it simply means that they are holding on to at least one. Do note though, other cards like Imperious Perfect and Elvish Warmaster also forces the game to give them priority if they have enough mana for their abilities. In that case, them being given priority does not tell you anything about their hand. The game is simply checking to see if they'd like to activate their abilities. In contrast, this is what happens when your opponent is denied priority. Notice how your own spells resolve almost instantly, barring animations, and your opponent's avatar remains dark in between the resolution of spells and abilities across steps and phases. Here's a slightly more complex example. In this game, I was going against Azorius artifacts. I was getting absolutely destroyed by my opponent who had 2 cards in hand, a revealed Jegantha the Wellspring which they paid 3 for on their previous turn, and another unknown card in hand. I was looking at lethal. They had 12 power on the board staring down at my measly 5 life. I want you to watch this short segment to see if you noticed 2 pieces of critical information for my next play. Did you see it? The astute amongst you would have noticed that the opponent was denied priority on several occasions. Being denied priority despite activation of Castle Ardenvale rules out Stifle. Being denied priority despite the token coming into play rules out cards like Fading Hope and Fateful Absence. This effectively also rules out Opt and Consider, since they would have been given priority during each phase of the combat step, as well as during each phase of my turn. However, they were given priority when I attempted to resolve Expressive Iteration. Since nothing about the board state has changed, it meant that the unknown card could only interact with the Expressive Iteration on the stack. At this point I was expecting some form of counter magic, with the likely ones being a Metallic Rebuke or a Dovin's Veto. What it is exactly doesn't matter much given our board state, but we now know that they have a counter in hand and they are holding it back for something crucial. Knowing this, I put Divine Purge in my hand to hide it so they don't see it coming, pun intended, revealed Fragment Reality in exile, then targeted Netosis with it. The opponent wasn't having this and denied it with the counter magic we already knew was in their hand, which was exactly what I wanted. The coast is now clear for me to sweep their entire board, setting them back so much they went from futuristic limousines to feed Power Stone wagons. You can watch how that game unfolded in the little pop-up here. The following examples should hopefully help you understand exactly when Magic Arena grants your opponent's priority. I was up against Izzet Charbelcher in this matchup. My opponent tapped out for a Faithless Looting, but was given priority when I attempted to see the truth on my turn, and denied priority for my remaining steps and phases for the turn. This basically screams Pact of Negation, since it is the only card that would be given priority in this situation. When they tapped out for Goblin Charbelcher, I knew my next turn basically decides the outcome of the game. I cast a Fragment Reality on their Charbelcher, and they stopped it with the pact we knew they had in their hand. I casted a second Fragment, only to be stopped by a second pact which I didn't see coming. With only 3 mana to work with, my deck had exactly one way out. I had to find a third copy of Fragment Reality off of Expressive Iteration. I could have been greedy and gambled to find an untapped source of white mana and a third Fragment Reality, but since the game is basically over the next turn, it made no sense to risk squeezing for that little bit of value. Instead, I shocked myself with the Steam Vents and tapped my mana accordingly to ensure that I'd be able to cast Fragment Reality if I were to see it. The opponent was denied priority this time, and we actually found the answer we were looking for. I got rid of the Charbelcher this time, and since our opponent had no Charbelchers to kill us in response to the triggers of their pacts, they died to their own pacts. In this matchup, a different opponent was also piloting Izzet Charbelcher. They had a treasure open and were given priority when we attempted to resolve Narset. The few cards that came to mind are a Pact of Negation, an Offer You Can't Refuse, or a Spell Pierce. Whatever it was, they kept it in their hand and tapped out for a Charbelcher the following turn. When we tried to see the truth on our turn, they were denied priority. This interaction rules out Pact of Negation, since they would still have been given priority if they were actually holding on to one. Knowing they have no pacts, I knew I could guarantee getting rid of their Charbelcher, so that's what I did. On my following turn, I resolved the second Narset without my opponent getting priority. This is due to them not being able to generate the 1 blue mana needed to cast the counter they had in their hand. On a later turn, when they had their blue mana open, they were denied priority when we casted Arcane Proxy, but were given priority when we attempted to see the truth from the graveyard. This is congruent to our hypothesis that they were holding onto either a Spell Pierce or an Offer You Can't Refuse, since both cards can only interact with the See the Truth on the stack, but not in Arcane Proxy. They were also given priority when I attempted to resolve Search for Azcanta, which again can be responded to with either of the aforementioned counter magic. Unfortunately, we were unable to definitively prove that they indeed had said counterspell in their hand, as they considered shortly after. Still, I hope this gives you a better idea of how knowing what cards your opponents usually run, and paying attention to when they are both given and denied priority can provide valuable insight to what they have in their hand. As mentioned earlier, there are cases where Magic Arena passes priority for you despite having available legal actions to take. The following interaction with Yorion and the Emperor is something I frequently do when piloting Jeskai Truths, a homebrew I took to Mythic. You can find out more about that deck in the little pop-up here. The Emperor's passive allows you to activate her abilities at instant speed as long as she entered the battlefield this turn. She usually gets flashed in to either beef up a creature in combat, or exile a tapped threat and gain some life along the way. After which she returns to a regular, sorcery speed Planeswalker. By flickering the Emperor with Yorion, you get to both refresh her loyalty and activate any of her abilities once more during your end step. However, you have to put a stop at your end step, otherwise Magic Arena assumes you have nothing to do and simply passes the turn. It is unknown why Magic Arena doesn't hold priority for you, since activating the Emperor is a perfectly legal action to take. That said, until the developers fix it, you'll have to put a stop here to squeeze that additional activation at your end step. The same is true for Teferi, Master of Time. To summarize, the way you weaponize this is by paying attention to when the game gives and denies your opponent priority. Cards like Soul Guide Lantern render this strategy useless as it doesn't cost any mana to activate. This means that its controller will be given priority through every step and phase for as long as it remains on battlefield. You won't be able to discern between them getting priority from the lantern or from an instant in their hand. Knowing the valid targets of your opponent's cards is also important. You may have resolved the Soulscar Mage without Arena giving priority to your opponent, but that doesn't mean your Wizard's Lightning will go uncontested, as they might be holding onto a Dovin's Veto, which is unable to interact with your creature spells. I hope you learned something in this video, and if you haven't already, break into Mythic and enjoy the 5 juicy packs at the end of the season. If you came this far, do drop me a like, and the comment section below is always open if you'd like further clarifications. Subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more Magic related content. This is Tipsy Atreus, adios.